Well, I don't know about you, but when I read today's parable again, my heart sank. I'm surprised you're still sitting here. Boy, I would be like, maybe I just need to get going and not think about this. Lazarus, this poor man who died because of indifference, is not just an ancient story. He is everywhere in our world. I can't walk down the street and not see a Lazarus. Indifference is so big in our world right now. And I tell you what, maybe you're not like me, but I can't even turn on the news sometimes because it is just so hard to turn on the news. Because the news always tells stories of destruction and indifference. Indifference is everywhere. If it's the frozen funding that withholds care from those who are most in need, or the political rhetoric that has gotten so bad and so violent that it has led to violence, which has created bigger chasms in our community, in our common life. Or the fact that creation care has seemed to be dropped off our narrative, off of our national radar, but we, as people who live in this world, deal with the aftermath every single day now. The floods that we just read about or saw in Arizona, July, the floods in Texas, and we living in a fire country, our hearts went with those in Los Angeles during the fires, right? We know what that destruction does and all the thousands who have lost homes and their lives. We see Lazarus at play over and over and over again. We can't even come to church without seeing Lazarus here on our campus, too. People who are unhoused, looking for a better social structure, right? And so my heart sank because the story names our community, all of us, right? And then it drops this hard line. There's this chasm in this story, right? And Abraham and Lazarus are on one side, and the man who was indifferent is on the other side, and the chasm is fixed. There's no restoration in this story. There's no second chance. Even generations after him are just led to what? That despair? That indifference? The thing that makes this parable so hard is that so much of it is true, that there is indifference in the world, and we all share in that indifference. And then you see what happens, and I thought the first time I read this again is God must be so frustrated with us. And if I leave it there, I could just stop preaching, right? But there's something wrong with the story. There's something wrong with the story. We don't believe in a God who gives up on us. We don't believe in a God who changes God's minds. We, at that point in time, should always say, hold on, something's wrong with the story. Oh, it's a parable. Parables are not moral tales. They're puzzles. Puzzles for us to think about our own behavior. Puzzles to help us lean into God's love even more. Old Testament and New Testament scholar A.G. Levine says that parables are meant to shock and surprise. And this one definitely shocks, right? In many, many layers. You have this rich man who lives his life lavishly, and he's the type of guy or person who would have their name on stadiums, right? It's true. But he's the only one that doesn't have a name in this story. He's the one forgotten. And the man who was forgotten on the gate of this man's property, Lazarus, is the one who has the name. And then there's that whole business about the chasm being fixed. They have the prophets. They should listen to them. They have already what they need. And we know that God doesn't quite work that way, and we alone can't fix all of these problems. It's not on our shoulders alone. It's with God's love and with God can we work on these problems. It's the God who seeks the lost, the God who meets the prodigal, the God who eats with sinners, the God who crosses over to the hurting. So what exactly is Jesus doing in today's parable? He's jolting us to remember one another so that we don't become indifferent. He's training us that with Christian sight, we should always see those who are broken and love them when we can, to keep our hearts open when our world, who cycles in outrage and apathy, will close them. And so I want to go back to the fear of the news. News tends to just tell the facts, sometimes leaning towards, tell the facts. That's even movable now, isn't it? It leans towards getting us to view and tune in even more. And what news sells? Bad news definitely sells. News that leads us to outrage and anger. And so, I don't know about you, but I go there. I go to that outrage where it burns hot and quick, and it wakes us, but there's no way we can sustain that, which falls into the other side. It keeps that outrage and that anger keeps us scrolling and performing out our anger and confines us to our own homes and our own worlds, separating us even more. But apathy works in the other way. I sometimes fall into this. If I can't handle the news because it's so hard to watch, sometimes I just don't watch the news. How many of you are like this? Sometimes I'm just like, I can't even today, so I'll watch a movie instead. I'll close the curtains, watch a movie that I like in a world that is very different than ours, and see the two people fall in love despite all odds, right? The truth with that is that that's moving into just hiding and being apathetic to it, and it's fatigue, right? That's why we're doing this. It's fatigue, but if we turn all of that off, the chasm widens because we don't see and we don't know. And we, as Christian community, know that we have to have that Christian sight, right? That sight to always look for the heart in everyone and to share that love despite no matter what happens. So how do we live as a people who keeps our hearts open when the system wants us to be apathetic and have outrage? Well, first, know that the news is only telling a bit of the story. Yes, there are people who are homeless, but it doesn't tell the story of Trinity Center. Yes, people die in these floods, but it doesn't tell the story of the community coming together. We, as a community of faith, know this because we have been on the front lines for those who we love. And this week, for me personally, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of Helene. I know this because my sister, who lived in Asheville, was planning her wedding the day after Helene. Needless to say, that wedding didn't go as planned, My sister lost her home, and she came so close to losing her life. And we, as a family, didn't hear from her for hours upon hours upon hours, up to 2 days of not hearing from her to see if she was even alive. It was really hard. And we were lucky because she was alive. And so the story tells the story about how FEMA is falling short, and that is true, and how families like my sister's are stuck with no clear pathway to rebuild because the work requires so much more than one person can do. But it misses the stories that I shared with you after the hurricane. The stories of when I was in North Carolina and we went to go pick her up, the stories of the cars filled with generators and chainsaws and everything they could from their shed, driving to the area where it was devastated to help people out. It doesn't tell the story of how my sister had church groups that would come up to her and her partner, so she's a lesbian, with her partner, and these church groups don't agree with how my sister lives her life. These church groups would work on her house because they were one community, despite the differences. It doesn't tell the story of how one day my sister, coming back from an errand, found a generator on her porch. Just a generator, which was the second generator she had been offered, by the way. It doesn't tell these stories that we know as a community of faith that God is at work in the middle of all these tragedies. That indifference is only part of the story. That there are people who believe in God's love and hope working on the scenes. Now, what about the other parts? For the communities that are far away, what do we do? How do we continue to always keep our heart open? I think Sabbath is the answer. Remembering, Sabbath isn't just about rest. It's about remembering that you are God's love and beloved, and resting in that love and belovedness. On Friday, I attended a funeral. It was a hard funeral. This person, she died when she was 58, tragically. And the bishop was presiding, and he said something during communion, something that I've heard 1,000 times. Do this in remembrance of me, telling the story of Jesus, telling the community of what communion is like. But he said it in a way that I've never really heard it when it comes to communion. He said, do this in remembrance of me. Reminding the people that communion is ultimately about reconnecting, remembering, reconnecting with each other and reconnecting with God. Remembering that you are God's loved. That maybe the heart of the Sabbath is right here at this altar table. Do this in remembrance of me, not to recall, but remember that God is putting us back together. What storms and sorrow and indifference has dismembered. And here we can be Lazarus seen, named, and fed right here at this table. The forgotten are remembered. The chasms inside of us are crossed by God's love. And so from here, we can keep our hearts open. Only from this space. That we are sent, not to solve everything, but to do the next fateful thing. To notice people. To love people, to make the call when funds are frozen or to show up when help is thin. One step at a time, one step away from indifference towards love. So this parable, it shakes us awake, but the God we know restores life and love. And the Eucharist we are called into remembers us into that life so that we can go out a people of hope, eyes open, hearts open, crossing the small chasms one person at a time until God heals us all. Amen.